In the large room of a house in a certain quiet city in Flanders, a man was gilding a devil. The chamber looked on to the quadrangle round which the house was built, and the sun, just overhead, blazed on the vine leaves clinging to the brick and sent a reflected glow into the somber spaces of the room. The devil, rudely cut out of wood, rested by his three tails and his curled back horns against the wall, and the man sat before him on a low stool. On the table in front of the open window stood a row of knights in fantastic armor, roughly modeled in clay. Beside them was a pile of vellum sheets covered with drawings in brown and green. By the door a figure of St. Michael leaned against a chair, and round his feet were painted glasses of every color and form. On the whitewashed wall hung a winged picture representing a martyrdom. Its vivid hues were the most brilliant thing in the room. The man was dressed in brown. He had a long, dark face and straight, dull hair. From the roll of gold leaf on his knee, he carefully and slowly gilded the devil. The place was utterly silent, the perfect stillness enhanced by the dazzle of the blinding sun without. Presently the man rose and, crossing to the window, looked out. He could see the sparse plants bordering the neglected grass-grown paths, the house opposite with its double row of empty windows, and the yellowing vine leaves climbing up the tiled roof that cut the polished blue of the August sky. Relaxed, he stood for a while contemplating his handiwork, then washed his brushes and put away his paints and gold leaf. By now the sun had changed and was shining full into the room, casting hot shadows of the vine leaves over the little clay knights and dazzling St. Michael's wet red robe. For the second time the young man left the room, now to go into the hall and open the door that gave upon the street. He looked on to an empty marketplace surrounded by small houses falling into decay. Beyond them the double towers of the cathedral flying upwards across the golden blue. The young man shaded his eyes and gazed across the dazzling dreariness. The shadow of his slack, slim figure was cast into the square of sun thrown across the hall through the open door. Under the iron bell that hung against the lintel stood a basket of bread, a can of milk, and some meat wrapped in a linen cloth. The youth took these in and closed the door. He traversed a large dining room, finely furnished, a small antechamber, came out into the arcaded end of the courtyard, entered the house by a low door next the pump, and so into his workshop again. There he proceeded to prepare his food. On the wide tiled hearth stood a tripod and an iron pot. He lit a fire under this, filled the pot with water, and put the meat in. Then he took a great book down off a shelf and bent over it, huddled up on a stool in the corner where the shade still lingered. It was a book filled with drawings of strange and horrible things, in close writing embellished with blood-red capitals. As the young man read, "Boss," his face grew hot and flushed where it rested on his hand, and the heavy volume fell cumbrous either side of his knee. Not once did he look up or change his twisted position, but with parted lips and absorbed eyes pored over the black lettering. The sun sank the other side of the house so that the garden and room were alike in shadow, and the air became cooler. Still the young man made no movement. The flames leapt on the hearth and the meat seethed in the pot unheeded. Outside the vine leaves curled against the brick, and the stone faces looked down at the broken fountain, the struggling grass and the tall white daisies. Still the young man, bending lower, his heated cheek pressed into his palm, his hair touching the page, bent over the great tome on his knee. Not the devil with his green eyes staring. Before him, not St. Michael in his red robe by the door, nor the martyr in the bright-winged picture, were more still than he crouched upon his wooden stool. Then, without prelude or warning, the heavy clang of a bell broke the silence into trembling echoes. The young man dropped the book and sprang to his feet. Red and white chased across his face. He stood panting, bewildered, with one hand on his heart and dazed eyes. Again the bell sounded. It could only be that which hung at the front door. Not for years had one rung it. He picked up the book, put it back on the shelf, and stood irresolute. For a third time the iron clang, insistent, impatient, rang through the quiet. The young man frowned, pushed back the hair from his hot forehead, and went with a light and cautious step across the courtyard, through the dark dining chamber into the hall. Here for a second he hesitated, then drew back the bolt and opened the door. Two men stood without. One was most gorgeously attired, The other wore a dark cloak and carried his hat in his hand.